So hello, New York Comic Con. Hello, BookCon. I'm Tricia Narwani, editorial director of Del Rey Books, and I'll be your moderator today. And I am honored to share the stage with some of the foremost writers of fantasy and science fiction. I'll introduce our panelists very quickly, say some outrageously nice things about them, warm up the conversation with a few questions, and then turn the discussion over to you. Because I think once you've met our panelists, you're going to have a lot of really great questions for them. So Naomi Novik first enchanted us all with the Temeraire series, which makes the Napoleonic Wars even more interesting by adding dragons. Her latest book, Uprooted, is her take on classic Polish folktales, and it's an absolute instant classic. Now, if you're already a fan of Naomi, she's going to share a little something special that you'll be really excited about. And if you're not lucky enough to have read her yet, you're going to want to right away after you hear about this. C.A. Higgins began her career last year with the brilliant science fiction epic Lightless, which features blood-curdling intrigue, a lot of actual blood, and the most badass ship's engineer since Cayley Fry. Now, if you don't have any questions for the end of the panel, just ask C.A. about Star Trek or Dragon Age, and you'll make her super happy. Now, our next two panelists... are not just debut authors. This is their first convention. They've just had their first signings yesterday, and this is their very first panel. So please give them a warm New York Comic Con welcome. So Vic James is the author of Gilded Cage, and Vic loves to say that it's full of all the stuff she loves most, and I think it's safe to say that you guys might like this stuff too. It's a decadent treat full of wicked, sexy aristocrats, Downton Abbey-esque country estates, dark magic, and a crush-worthy villain who could be played by young Tom Hiddleston. We'll be giving it away after the panel with a purchase at the signing. So Katherine Arden is the author of The Bear and the Nightingale. So The Bear and the Nightingale is one of those magical books that just transports you to a faraway place from the very first page. In this case, to a medieval Russia where fairy tales and folklore are real, and the most dangerous thing of all is a powerful and defiantly modern young woman. We'll also be giving that one away at the signing with purchase. Now, if you've read the work of any of these great authors, their work is so beautifully crafted that it's almost easy to imagine that it just emerged fully formed in all their awesomeness like one of Daenerys' baby dragons. But as we'll learn, it took a lot of fire, blood, and coffee to shape these books into their perfect final form. So this panel is called Deleted Scenes, but I'm sure as you'll see from this conversation, that's just one part of the process, and we're going to begin with an inside look at it. Each author is going to read a brief scene from one of their books and explain why it didn't work, why it had to be revised, or how it inspired something new. So we'll begin with Katherine Arden.
This works. Okay, here's The Bear and the Nightingale book cover, and I'm going to now put it away so I don't drop it. And I'll just read a scene. My book is set in medieval Russia. And it includes both history and Slavic mythology or fairy tales. Here's a scene from what was the first third of the book, but it's no longer there. So anyway. Pyotr rubbed his face, staring at his second daughter and wondering how he and Marina between them had produced this forest imp. His daughter Vasya was 6 years old and a decidedly ugly little girl. Her bones jutted out of her face. Her eyes and mouth were too big for the rest of her. Worse, those eyes were a clear and changeable green, like water, and they gave her an unearthly look, unlike that of any of her siblings. As far as Pyotr could recall, his daughter Olga had slipped into the world pretty and sweet-faced and gentle. He certainly had never had to call her muddy and rebellious before him for punishment. Irina was sobbing on her mother's lap, dripping wet. Great streaks of mud marred the linen of her sarafan. Anna Ivanovna glared at Pyotr, fire in her eyes. She tried to drown my little girl, tried to drown my Irina. No, I didn't, Vasya flared before Pyotr could speak. I took her to meet the mudman in the river. She got too close, and he pulled her in. I saved her. Pyotr rubbed his face again. Irina adored her feral older sister. Whenever she could escape her mother's hovering, she would toddle off after Vasya, even though Vasya was usually to be found up a tree or under a rock, or in this case, beside the fast-flowing river, which in its time had claimed much bigger prey than the odd 4 or 6-year-old. And that was another mystery. How on earth had Vasya jumped into the river, seized her sister, and dragged her to the bank without drowning the both of them? The men working the fields had seen the whole thing, though by the time they gained the riverbank, Vasya had already hauled herself and Irina to safety, shivering, dripping, and ruining both their clothes. But Pyotr did not think that Anna, who was clutching her daughter and glaring at Vasya, would see the escapade in the light of a rescue. "Vasya," Pyotr said, trying for patience, "you know the river is dangerous even to grown men. What possessed you to go so near the edge?" "I told you, the mudman—" Anna had her mouth open to protest, and Pyotr hurriedly quelled his daughter. "Enough, Vasya," he said. "You've been listening to too many stories. It was a very stupid thing to do." There was a mutinous set to the small pointed chin, but Vasya met her father's gimlet eye and subsided. "Yes, father," she said. "You are to stay in the village proper for a fortnight." Pyotr saw the protest forming on his daughter's lips and thought wistfully of Olga, who had never needed forbidding because she never showed any interest in roaming. "I mean it," he said. Vasya bit her lip. Pyotr looked down at his daughter's dark, drooping, wet head. "Vasya," he said in a gentler tone. Vasya straightened her shoulders, unspeaking, all eyes and jutting bones and bloodless lips, shivering in her clinging wet dress. "It was a brave thing you did," Pyotr said, "to jump in and save your sister." "It was nothing, father," Vasya said. "The mudman wouldn't hurt me." Pyotr raised his eyebrows. Her nurse told her too many fairy tales, that was plain. "Out," he said. "Go find Dunya. She'll see you clean and warmed up." Vasya rewarded her father with a shining smile and darted for the kitchen, leaving a puddle where she had stood. Anna Ivanovna was still cradling her daughter. Little Irina's wails of fright had subsided into a whimper. Her mother murmured to her and stroked the silky brown curls. "You are too soft with that girl, Pyotr Vladimirovich," Anna said, keeping her eyes on Irina's draggled hair. Pyotr made no reply. What could he say? Of course he was. He had allowed his daughter to grow up savage and headstrong and spoiled, and it was because, ugly or no, small, valiant Vasya reminded him more of Marina than any of his other children. 6 years since her death. And Pyotr still woke, reaching for his first wife. That was good, punctuation. Each time, there was that small, cold shock to see a stranger in her place. But he could not say so. Instead, he said, "You ought to get Irina dry." Anna nodded stiffly and got up, still cradling her daughter. Her foot was on the threshold when she whirled to face him. The words bursting out of her unbidden. "You love her more. You love that ugly little fiend more than my daughter, who is pretty and sweet and good and hardworking and everything she should be. Why, husband? Why?" Pyotr could see the tears in his wife's blue eyes, but she swept out, not waiting for a reply. Just as well. He had nothing to say.
So Katherine, can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to leave that out of the final version?
Yeah, of course. Well, this scene was in the book for quite a long time, and it ended up coming out because I changed the book's chronology fairly late in the process. In the original draft, the main character was born in the first chapter, and she was a very young child, an infant for the first third of the book. And my editor pointed out that it's hard to relate to an infant as a main character, and so, because their thoughts are fairly limited, so she said, well, what if you just skipped a few years and aged her up faster so the audience could grow to like her as a person instead of just having other characters be the main focus. So I aged her up, but that made this scene impossible. with the chronology, because she'd been too old at that point to have this moment with her sister. So it came out fairly straightforward.
That kind of chronology issue comes up really often. Sometimes it's just about skipping to like the really good parts.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
Also, don't make your main character a baby. I'm not sure it really helps.
I think if that's the only thing you learn from this panel, you're doing really well.
Writing tip.
It's Sir not appearing in this film, right?
Right.
So next up, Caitlin Higgins is going to take us to outer space.
Yes, so this is a scene from Lightless, and it actually was something we're passing it down. It was something that was cut so early that Tricia didn't even know I did this to begin with, so it's going to be a surprise to her too. Is it hard? Asked Maddie, and the question was so far from what we had been discussing that I didn't know what he meant. He clarified, knowing you could see your home planet if you only went a few thousand kilometers that way. We were in our rented room, a few blocks away from our target. The room was dark and dusty, windows showing nothing but the coal dust color of the lunar surface and the dark gray of all its buildings and all its people. If I went to see it, I said, then I'd have to realize it would only be a couple 100,000 kilometers to actually go home. And then I'd take the Anoon and get shot down in the atmosphere. I smirked at him. He leveled me a look of exasperation and tried to flick his bangs out of his eyes, only succeeding in sending them drifting absurdly through the air by his forehead. This was somewhere around the 100th time he had done precisely the same thing, and I think by this point he was getting a little tired of my glee. I think you're a little smarter than that, he said. Only a little, mind you. Your faith in my impulse control overwhelms and humbles me. I was offering, I know what you are offering, I said. We can fly by as we get out, said Maddie. Tell the system we're using the grav field to slingshot. Maybe if I'm clumsy, we'll get close enough to see those lakes you've told me about. It's too risky, and slingshotting will send us in the wrong direction, I said. Could be the last time you'll ever get a chance to see her, said Maddie. Probably, I agreed. Maddie looked at me, just looked at me for a long time. I've always liked that about him. He uses words like blunt knives, getting the gist of what he means and never the precise purpose, never delicate with them because he won't get anything done otherwise. But he knows silence. He said, okay. When we left Luna, we went on a strangely precise trajectory so that, for a long time, Earth and the Moon were right beside each other, like a child's model, and North America was facing us just as evening was falling, the lights of cities starting up in the east and traveling slowly west until the planet was too far away to see.
So can you tell us a little bit about how that ended up on the cutting room floor?
Yes, so Lightless has two plot lines going on, and the one that this is from is an interrogation between this woman, Ida, and this man, Ivan. And originally, I had Ivan's sections in first-person point of view from his perspective, which really didn't work and got entirely cut out. And then I turned the interrogation into just dialogue between him and Ida from Ida's point of view. And I got rid of the first person because if he's being interrogated, he's not going to tell his interrogator about how his best friend was flicking his hair out of his eyes. And so there was all this question of, is this verbatim what he's saying? Is it the actual truth but not what he's telling Ida? And it complicated it in an unnecessary way. Plus, the sort of emotional vulnerability that you'd get in the first-person point of view is not something Ivan would show to the woman who's interrogating him, especially not when it pertains to Maddie, which the scene is about.
So how many of these first-person scenes did you have to write before you knew that it wasn't going to work out?
I wrote a whole draft.
Well, it seems like
2 or 3.
Like sometimes you have to write it out before you know that it's wrong?
Yes, I wrote a whole draft and gave it to some of my first readers, and they were like, this is not working. This is not working. And I was like, you're right, this is not working. And so then I rewrote the whole thing.
So now Vic will read her scene.
Hi, I'm Vic James. I'm the author of Gilded Cage. Gilded Cage is set in a contemporary Britain with one important twist. It's not ruled by a royal family. It's ruled by an aristocratic elite who have magical skill. And in this world, everybody else who is without magic, that's the 99% of the rest of us, has to spend 10 years doing their days. This is 10 years of service. Now, usually that's spent in pretty grim, they're called slave towns, factory work, sort of back office, processing, every kind of job you really wouldn't want to do. But there's one sort of resourceful family, the Hadleys, and they've decided that they're going to chance their hand at doing something different during their slave days. So they apply to go into service directly at one of the grand estates of one of the aristocratic families. Now, they get sent to Kynaston, the seat of the Jardines, who just happen to be, wouldn't you know it, the most powerful, the wealthiest, and the most ruthless of all of the equals who rule Britain. So in the bit I'm just about to read you, all of the Hadley family are assigned jobs once they arrive at Kynaston, and the youngest Hadley child is Daisy. Now, she's only 11 years old, and she gets given a rather unexpected job. Her job is to be the babysitter of the bastard child of the heir of Kynaston, who is a charismatic and violent young man called Gavar. And this scene is an encounter in the woods. Daisy has taken baby Libby for a walk, and she doesn't know it yet, but she's about to have an interesting encounter with the youngest Jardine son, who is called Cillian, who is rumored to be the most powerful and the most unscrupulous magic user of his generation. So it starts off as a nice walk in the woods, and then it goes downhill from there. It's where I hope I don't start reading my personal email. A short way off, in a glade open to the sky, stood a tree. Daisy knew, even without her recent swatting, that it was a cherry. The blossom gave it away. The tree was covered in so many flowers that the branches bent down to the forest floor under the weight of them. In the crisp autumn air, the strong, sweet scent was unmistakable. The sight of it was mesmerizing. Daisy moved towards it. She put her palms out and brushed them over the blossom, luxuriating in the dense flowers. She encouraged Libby to touch them too, and had to stop the baby tearing off handfuls to stuff into her mouth. "Isn't it pretty?" Daisy told the delighted baby, shaking petals over her. "Isn't it lovely?" Except it was also, some part of her brain belatedly told her, very wrong. Daisy let her hand continue to flap mechanically, continuing the petal shower while she thought about it. She might be only 10, but she knew that you saw flowers like this in springtime. They were printed on Easter cards. Sometimes in art class, you got sent outside in the sunshine to paint them. You didn't see blossoms like this when winter was closing in. She felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with any breeze. Earlier, she'd encountered a deer that was dead when it shouldn't be. Here was a tree, alive and blossoming when it shouldn't be. "Okay, sweetie," she told the baby, moving the branch back out of reach. "We're going to go now. We're going to have a little picnic back by the big house." She only saw him when she turned. He was sitting on the ground several meters away, legs stretched out in front of him, and his back propped up against a tree trunk. His hair was matted, and he'd raked it back from his face, which looked thin and tired, but his eyes were bright with curiosity as he watched them. The young master, Cillian Jardine. For a moment he said nothing, and neither did she. Then he jumped to his feet, a smooth, quick motion, and strolled over to where Daisy stood. He reached out and offered a finger to Libby, who seized it and started chewing enthusiastically. Daisy would have liked to step away, but she couldn't do so without breaking their contact. "Do you like my tree?" said Cillian Jardine. "Your tree?" said Daisy, stupidly, because they were all his trees, she supposed, or his family's. "Yes," He smiled, and it was bright and cold as the day. Or to be more accurate, my experiment. And from that scream you gave earlier, I'm guessing you found my other experiment too, the deer. This one's prettier though, isn't it? I don't know what you mean, Daisy said. Little Libby was my inspiration, actually, said Cillian, waggling his finger in his niecey gummy mouth as she blew bubbles around it. Or rather, her mother was, when my brother Gavar shot her, and she died right there in front of us.
So can you tell us a little bit about why that scene didn't make it in?
So this is a pretty key moment. It's when we discover that Cillian Jardine is really up to no good. And part of the structure of Gilded Cage is that it's told from multiple points of view. We have sort of 5 or 6 main points of view, and the chapters are told sort of variously from whichever character. As a writer, I felt that gave me immense freedom to share the information that we knew, and also to hide information from other protagonists. So at various points, you'll be reading someone who is or isn't aware of something that you do or do not already know as the reader. The story focuses on actually Daisy's two older siblings, so Luke, who is 16, and Abby, who is 18. And Abby's role in the story is essentially to be the person who pieces it all together. The story is sort of part political thriller, it's part sort of family dynastic sort of tale of secrets and intrigue. And Abby is really the one who has to sort of put all the pieces together, and it just became kind of very, very obvious to me that with this sort of pivotal revelation and this sort of pivotal insight into the fact that Cillian is not what maybe he seems, I just knew that that had to be Abby. So there's a version of this scene in Gilded Cage, and it's from Abby's point of view.
I was thinking it sounded very familiar. It sounds a lot like when Abby first meets Cillian. I think you're right, it works out much better this way. Daisy's a delightful character, and she's one of my favorite characters, but sometimes you have to make that hard decision to focus on what's best for the story.
Yeah, I mean, I just felt that again, a 10-year-old, there's sort of certain pieces that she is not going to put together. So the question of Gavar, the older brother, the older Jardine brother, again, sort of is he exactly what he seems? He's very powerful, he's charismatic, but at the same time he can seem very brutal, very callous, and yet he forms a very close friendship with Daisy. One of the more sort of unexpected kind of friendships in the book. It's not all dark and horrid. And again, it was very important to me that Daisy is a character who we kind of feel emotion through, whereas Abby is someone, obviously we're very much sort of emotionally invested in her story, but she's the one that has to kind of figure it all out. And a 10-year-old, no matter how smart, is not going to pick up on everything that's going on at Kynaston.
So yeah, 10-year-olds almost as hard as babies as characters.
It's like the panel takeaway, like make your main characters old enough to think thoughts.
Or like Harry Potter, right? Harry Potter's 10 years old at the start of the first 11.
10-year-old
Turns 11.
Turns
like,
11.
That's the
Right.
cutoff.
Yeah.
cut off.
Yeah.
11 or higher.
She'd just been 1 year older.
Yeah.
Right.
Naomi, would you like to?
Great. All right, so first I'm going to show you the book, Uprooted. This is the most recent one. No, it's not. League of Dragons is the most recent one, but this is Uprooted. And the thing that I'm going to read has nothing to do with this book, but it's very pretty. Look at my cover. I will pass it along. So I actually, because I wrote Uprooted, it doesn't have nothing to do with this book. So Uprooted was heavily inspired by fairy tales that I grew up with in my home. My parents are from Poland and Russia, and they shared a lot of fairy tales with me. And after I wrote Uprooted, I was invited to participate in an anthology called The Starlit Wood, which was rewriting fairy tales. That was the idea. And I said, sure, that sounds fun. And there was a long list of fairy tales, and most of them had been taken. But one was left on there that kind of caught my eye, and that was Rumpelstiltskin. And so I started writing this, and they were looking for about a 5,000 to 6,000 word story. And my story sailed past that and sailed past 10,000 words. And at some point I was like, wait a second, I'm kind of going too long. So that actually, I finished it as a short story, but so I had to go back in a way and rejigger it as a short story. And what I'm going to read to you now is a little bit of that opening of that short story, and then the line that made me realize that that I needed to go on, that I needed to go back and sort of wrestle it down. And what I actually ended up doing afterwards was going to Del Rey and saying, so I've written this short story, but it wants to be a novel. And that is going to be the next project. And it's called Spinning Silver. Yay. Yay. The real story isn't half as pretty as the one you've heard. The real story is the miller's daughter with her long golden hair wants to catch a lord, a prince, a rich man's son. So she goes to the moneylender and borrows for a ring and a necklace and decks herself out for the festival. And she's beautiful enough, so the lord, the prince, the rich man's son notices her and dances with her and tumbles her in a quiet hayloft when the dancing is over. And afterwards, he goes home and marries the rich woman his family has picked out for him. Then the miller's disappointed daughter tells everyone that the moneylender's in league with the devil, and the village runs him out or maybe even stones him. So at least she gets to keep the jewels, and the blacksmith marries her before that firstborn child comes along a little early. Because that's what the story is really about, getting out of paying your debts. That's not how they tell it, but I knew. My father was a moneylender, you see. He wasn't very good at it. If someone didn't pay him back on time, he never so much as mentioned it to them. Only if our cupboards were really bare or our shoes were falling off our feet, and my mother spoke quietly with him after I was in bed. Then he'd go, unhappy, and knock on a few doors and make it sound like an apology when he asked for some of what they owed. And if there was money in the house and someone asked to borrow, he hated to say no, even if we didn't really have enough ourselves. So all his money, most of which had been my mother's money, her dowry, stayed in other people's houses. And everyone else liked it that way, even though they knew they ought to be ashamed of themselves. So they told the story often, even or especially when I could hear it. My mother's father was a moneylender too, but he was a very good one. He lived in Vishnya, 40 miles away by the pitted old trading road that dragged from village to village like a string full of small, dirty knots. Mama often took me on visits when she could afford to pay someone to let us ride along at the back of a peddler's cart or a sledge, 5 or 6 changes along the way. Sometimes we caught glimpses of the other road through the trees, the one that belonged to the Static, gleaming like the top of the river in winter when the snow had blown clear. "Don't look, Miriam," my mother would tell me, but I always kept watching it out of the corner of my eyes, hoping to keep it near, because as long as it was, whoever was driving the cart would slap the horses and hurry them up until it vanished again. And so that's the opening of Spinning Silver. And then the piece, I'm hopping over to the piece that where I had to stop and say, oh, wait a second, this isn't working. This is going to take me a lot longer. So what happened in the intervening time is Miriam becomes the moneylender in her father's stead. And she is a very good moneylender. And at one point, she gets a purse full of silver from her grandfather, and she brings back a purse to him full of gold. And she brags, as they are driving home to the forest, she brags to her mother, that she has her mother has a daughter who can turn silver into gold. And a few days later, one of the Static, these are sort of people in the woods, comes out and hands her a purse of silver and says, "Turn it into gold." And she keeps going and she works with this, but So without trying to repeat what happens in the whole story, this scene comes along. "But what use can I be to you?" I said desperately. "I have no magic. I can't change silver to gold for you in your kingdom if you take me away." "Of course you can," he said, as if I was being a fool. "A power claimed and challenged and thrice carried out is true. The proving makes it so." And he vanished, leaving me with a casket full of silver and a belly full of dismay. And so the way I tend to do my world building in stories is I tend to write a scene that comes out of a sort of gut level idea of what the world is like, and the scene tells me a little bit more about the world, and then I figure out, what details, what don't I know about the world already that would make this scene make more sense? What does this scene tell me about the world? And thinking that through gives me the next scene. So it's sort of a ongoing process throughout the book. And as soon as I wrote those lines, so I knew there had to be some reason. Why did the Stark want Miriam? Why did he want to make her work for him? And because, of course, she's just an ordinary girl. She doesn't have magical power. She can't actually turn silver into gold. And I didn't think the Stark was a fool. I didn't think that he was mistaken. But writing that line told me the basic magical concept that once you brag about something, and there's so many fairy tales, right, where we know that that's a very bad idea. There are Greek myths where, you brag about something, the gods are going to come after you and smack you down hard. And I really like the idea that one of the reasons for that is when you bragged about something in this universe, if you could prove it 3 times, if you could somehow carry out being challenged to do it 3 times. So if the star gives her silver 3 times and she manages to change it into the equivalent amount of gold, then actually she will gain that magical power. But the problem is that immediately opened up so many more questions for me about the universe. There was so much more, and I was very excited about doing it, but I had a deadline. So I stopped and I finished the short story. And yes, so that's what I'm going to be working on now.
I've read the story. It is incredible and amazing, and you do really, really want to learn more about this amazing world that Naomi's created.
I should mention that's actually coming out in an anthology. The Starlit Wood anthology is coming out this month. So it's a beautiful book. So yeah.
So what I've been hearing a lot from all of you is that you've all discovered a lot about your books and the actual process of writing them. So in the most recent book, what did you discover while you were writing it? What was most surprising? What did you enjoy the most? What was really challenging? Would you like to start?
Would I like to start? What did I discover? I mean, Gilded Cage is actually my first novel, full stop. So I discovered that if you want to write a novel, you have to get to the end of it. That was probably the first thing I discovered. And of course, that actually throws up all sorts of slightly, I was going to say unexpected problems, but you should probably expect to finish a book, in terms of just sort of where you leave your characters at the end of it. Gilded Cage is the first of a 3-part story. And for me, the originating moment, I knew sort of exactly sort of where my characters were going to set off, and I knew exactly where they were going to finish, but they're not finishing for 3 books' time. So for me, the question has been, and I've just finished a first draft of book 2, which will also be out next year. And for me, that the question of sort of where do I structure, where do I seed the information that we need to know in order to sort of to reach that final point. So quite a lot of my sort of revision process in book 1 was thinking, hang on a minute, we don't need to know this yet, or sort of discovering that actually something in the denouement of book 1, which is quite explosive, literally, what do we need to know in order for that to make sense? So it was actually sort of trying to think logically through something that is in many ways quite an emotional experience. You know, you're telling a story because you want to go on an emotional journey with your characters, but it's also got to make sense. ideally. So that was my challenge.
I guess I'll go next. I find the first like steps in drafting are very like gut instinct, like write a scene that appeals to you, write a character that you wanted to hear about, and you write more and more of those scenes until they start cohering. And then at some point, you do have to impose like a logic to what you're doing. With Bear and the Nightingale, I went through several possible stories that I could have told that ended up not being the best possible story, so I would cut it and redo it and cut it and redo it. So I almost feel like there's more than one way to skin a cat, as my grandmother says. There's more than one way to write a story, so it's more a question of like fitting it together and then doing it again and again till it feels right, like inside you, like it reads well for you, and then you have a book, and it's kind of surprising. A little bit, anyway.
I guess I tend to be both a linear writer and a discovery writer. I don't outline basically at all. And I need to do that because if I figure out too much of my story, if I know too much about the world that I'm in, I don't need to write it down anymore because I know everything. And I don't, at that point, it's like my editor's like, well, I can't publish a book with no writing on the pages. But I'm like, but I know, I could tell you, and it doesn't really work. So I like the feeling of never really quite knowing what's going on, what's going to happen as I go. And that does involve, writing things that you then have to throw away. I do a lot of that. I write a scene and out it comes. And I feel like I learn new things with every scene that I write. But as soon as I have written them, as soon as they sort of settle in and stay, it feels to me like I've always known them. So I'm not surprised anymore, in a way, I guess, because it does feel sort of organic in that way. I'm trying to think of something that surprised me. The end of the last Temeraire book, the very end, the person who ends up on the French throne at the end, was a surprise to me. I didn't figure that out until book 6 of the series, and it's a 9-book series. But while I was working on book 6, that character, I suddenly realized that character was going to exist, and I suddenly realized, and the character doesn't appear until book 7, actually, in the series. But I figured it out around there, and that was kind of a surprise. So, more than 2/3 of the way through the series, I figured
Even
out.
deep into a book or deep into a series,
Yeah.
you can still discover new things about your
Yeah.
world. Yeah.
I think if your book doesn't surprise you, you won't surprise anyone else. You know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely.
if you're not like, oh, that's interesting, or that's different, or I didn't expect that, like, how are you going to make other people also be surprised by where your book's going,
Right, if you're writing to a rigid formula.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know.
For me, what happens doesn't usually change from scenes I delete because I'm an obsessive outliner, so I've got the plot down in 90-page documents. But what does change is how I'm telling the story, because there's what's happening, which the earlier drafts, I'll just write it down, which is not necessarily the most interesting way to tell you what's happening, because I won't time the information that you want in a way that's most dramatic. And so in this scene in particular, I actually kept the substance of the scene. I just moved it to be condensed in dialogue and actually kept some of the same prose when Ivan is talking to a different character, Althea. But the way that I told it was totally different because it went from being this scene that just tells you anything without really sort of altering the way that you think about these characters to a scene where the character who's telling the story has ulterior motives and is trying to do something, and it's a much more interesting way of telling it. So a lot of the scenes that I delete, I'll sort of keep the same information, I'll just tell it in a way that's more exciting.
Actually, thinking about that a little more, what you were saying about surprising yourself, One of the ways in which I often surprise myself, and this I think works because I don't have the plot actually in advance, is partly because is listening to characters, and very often I go into a scene and I think, well, this is going to happen in this scene, and I start writing it, and then the character's personality, the things the character holds dear, suddenly make them say something or do something that doesn't actually fit with my idea of where the scene was going to go. And when that happens, I always try to follow it, because I feel like, staying true to the characters and letting the characters lead your story. I sort of think of it as a universe in which all the million alternate universes that every moment creates. And when you have a character who sort of takes you into a slightly different universe than the one you thought you were in, that I think creates that kind of surprise for yourself and also for the reader, too.
Those discoveries can be kind of like gifts in that way. I think we've got time for some audience questions. Does anybody have a question for our panelists?
Oh, yes, we've been
told there will be a throwable microphone.
You can actually fling the microphone. It's soft.
Oh, there it is. Okay, somebody who wants it.
Please ask a question.
Yes, you get to ask this with a unicorn.
Like you're catching the bouquet.
The microphone is being thrown to you. Yep.
See the guy with the cube?
Yep, stand up. Yep, yeah.
We want you to be as excited as we are about this.
Yes, we're really excited.
Very excited.
Yay!
So I talk into this?
Yes, you just speak into the microphone.
This is really cool. Okay. First of all, thanks so much for you guys coming out here and giving us all this very cool information. This was awesome. So my question is on editing. How did you know on the particular books that you talked about when it was time to stop, when you were done deleting and cutting, and you actually had maybe not the perfect book, but the book that you wanted to put out?
So the question is, how do you know when the book you've written is done? When you've done enough revising and it's ready to be read by other people?
I mean, who was it said that books are never finished, just abandoned? Someone said that. I mean, I feel like there's always something you could do. Like, you'll read your finished book and be like, I want to change this word, or why did this person say this? I mean, it's really hard to let go. Like, I started Bear the Nightingale in 2011. I finished it, and I ended up with Del Rey in 2014, and rewrote it several times, and I just made final edits on it 2 weeks ago. So, is it finished? I hope so, because I'm not changing anything else. But it's hard to let go, I would say, even if it's finished,
I usually have 3 signs. One is when I read it through and I don't have the reaction like, oh, it would be so much better if, he saved the princess then. There are no princesses in my books. And 2 is when I read it through and the only thing I'm doing is changing words and then changing them back. And then the 3rd thing is when I read it and I hate everything about this book. I never want to write a word again, and that means that I should stop because it's done.
I mean, I think there's 2 kinds of finished. It depends what you're talking about. I think for an author, your world is never finished because there's so much that just sort of can't fit between the pages of 3 books. And I think that's probably why we're seeing, sort of authors doing kind of e-novellas that fit between sort of books in series. J.K. Rowling is obviously so not done with the Harry Potter world, hooray. And I think that must be very, very common. If you're asking a slightly different question, which is at what point do I, if anyone here has written a manuscript, is sort of in the same place that I was 2 years ago, and you're sort of thinking, is this good enough to send to an agent? Will I be wasting my money if I try and send this off to a professional editor or a beta reader? That's a hard one to call, but the thing I would say to you is if you sort of have a sense of pride in your work, just sort of grit your teeth, send it off, accept it is never going to be perfect, accept it is never going to be finished. But if your dream is to find an audience for your book, you will not achieve that dream unless you sort of say, it is finished enough. It's finished enough for me to share it with somebody else. So if anybody in the audience is feeling like that right now, I would say, go home, spend this weekend, print it out, read it, and yeah, maybe Monday morning you'll feel it's finished enough to send it on the next stage of its journey.
I think for myself, I think one of the most important things, the most important piece of advice that I give actually to a lot of writers is to finish a lot of things. And you can't finish a lot of things if you're writing novels. The way I got started finishing things was I wrote fan fiction for 10 years before I ever wrote a novel. And I wrote story after story, and I was writing and there was no commercial audience for it, and there was absolutely no gatekeeping. So I would just write these stories, and they were done, and I felt when they were done. When I was happy with it, I had said what I wanted to say, and if it was 3,000 words, great. If it was 10,000 words, great. I rarely wrote long. But what that really taught me was how to recognize when a story is done, because I think that's just a skill set. Like anything else, how do you write a good sentence? How do you write a good paragraph? How do you write a good chapter? How do you know when the thing is done is another one of those skills, and you get better at things the more of it you do. So I actually strongly encourage any writers to finish a lot of things, and if that means sometimes you just end in a slightly weird place and you send it off, and you post it, you share it with friends, you submit it to a magazine, anything like that, that's fine. If you stick it in a drawer, that's also fine. As long as you feel like you get into the mindset of writing, working on a project, getting to where you feel like, okay, this is complete, and then you end it, and then you put it away. And for me, I generally find that I really like finishing things. I really try. One thing that might be useful is also trying to make your ending stick in a way of connecting back to the beginning. That's always a good thing to do, that when you come to the end of a story or a book or a series, you want to feel that the things you learn at the end illuminate the things that have happened all the way along, and give a new quality to the whole journey. And so that's my advice, anyway.
Next question. In the red in second row. Right there, in the red in the second row.
Yay!
Hey. Were there any scenes, characters, or whatever that you became really attached to, but for whatever reason it needed to be cut? Like, what helped you decide, like, all right, as much as I like this, I have to cut it, or even the opposite, like your editor said, hey, this is to be cut, but you had to fight, like, no, stay with me here. So like, what was the deciding factor to help you decide, like, if this stays or?
So the question is, what happens when you get really, really attached to a scene, you just love it for some reason, and you either realize on your own that it's not working, or an outside reader, like your editor, one of your beta readers, says this is not working, you definitely have to take it.
You cry.
Yeah, no, it's
Next
totally
question.
true. Yeah. Like, I find if you take it out, and if you don't notice it's gone after like 5 minutes, then it wasn't a good scene to begin with. But if you take it out and it's like, my scene is gone, this piece is missing, then you put it back in. But I feel like bad scenes, you can get so attached to them, but once they're out, you literally forget about them so quickly, like, because they didn't need to be there. So
I actually, usually my experience with that is when I'm writing, when a scene that I really like and that I really want in the book isn't working, it often means that I've broken something earlier. And so if there's something that I really feel like, I can't take this out. I mean, there are scenes, obviously, that you write and you like them and you're like, that doesn't kind of fit. I don't tend myself to get particularly attached emotionally to a particular scene. I'm happy to chop things out. But so it's the opposite problem that I have, which is that a scene that I feel like, okay, why isn't this landing? Why isn't this working? Why am I having trouble writing this scene sometimes? And that's usually because there's something a little earlier on in the book that's gone wrong. And that actually, I would say, is also true of almost always when somebody, when somebody gives me the kind of feedback of like, I don't like this scene, or I don't like this character, very often the specific thing that they're pointing to is not the thing that is broken. It is somewhere earlier along the way.
I agree with that. You have to look at why the scene shouldn't be there, and maybe it's because you didn't justify enough a character's choice 100 pages ago. But if the scene, or sometimes you can take the scene and you can just sort of redistribute the information because it still belongs there. It's just you're telling it wrong. But if it's a bad scene, I'd rather cut it. I don't get super attached to it. It should die. So
I think we have time for one more question. Right here.
no,
She's an outliner. You're like the crazy outliner.
Yeah.
I'm okay. I'm just over here.
Yay, NaNoWriMo, yay. You know what I love, I'm sorry, I'm totally like, do NaNoWriMo if you like to write. You know, the great thing about NaNoWriMo is that the pace of it encourages you to shut off your inner editor and your inner critic. And for a lot of people, I think that's a huge obstacle to their writing. And when you're writing that fast, that velocity, I think that really kind of lets you, you can't stop to think about it. You can't edit your scenes. So I think NaNoWriMo is a great way, if you've never written long, if writing long is a problem for you, you know, or if you've never gotten to that length, or if you find yourself kind of not finishing things and excessively trying to edit, I feel like, you know, yes, it's a great idea.
Yes.
I think maybe one more quick question. In the front row.
The box.
Everybody there? Very cool. So whether it's your first book or it's your 9th book or whatever, and you suddenly now get the cover. Have any of you reacted like they got it, or like, oh my God, this is like totally different?
So the question is about how you felt, your feelings about the cover process. Like, have you ever gotten a cover that you really loved or that you really disliked?
I have been so lucky with my covers. I've very rarely gotten a cover that I don't like. And I've been lucky enough to be involved in the process. Often they've shown me artists that they want me to consider and let me have input. You know, Del Rey is awesome like that. And you know, as an author, you try to approach that as a collaborator, you know, and I try to think, how many revisions would I like to be asked to make? You know, and so you try and think about the best advice you can give, I think, without being unreasonable.
So Katherine and I are both members of a Facebook group called the Swanky 17s, and it's for everybody who's got a debut coming out next year. And let me tell you, covers, they get talked about more than anything else. I mean, you know, people are
topic.
Opening their veins saying, I hate my cover. There are people, you know, sort of using every emoji on the emoji keyboard saying, I love my cover. And then there's sort of other people saying, what's your secret? How can I make my editor change my cover? It's a complete mystery to authors. Well, it's a complete mystery to this one. I've been extremely lucky. I've got 2 covers that I adore in both the UK and the US that at some point you just have to trust that as the author you can't do everything. You know, publishing professionals are the professionals for a reason. I think there's a gut response, and I think it's perfectly legitimate for those people who have the OMG, I hate my cover response. It is legitimate to channel that back and to articulate why. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the cover on Bear and Nightingale is beautiful. The first draft of the cover was very different. And it for a lot of reasons, I was not super into it, but I registered this to people, and we changed it, and we got to a place where it's beautiful, so that can happen. You get a cover and you don't like it, and you ask, and we talk about it, and they're great. Del Rey, way to go.
And time's up.
Yeah, so I believe we're out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to our amazing panelists.